But we'll get started talking about pet overpopulation and spay-neuter. So what does pet overpopulation even mean? So let's start with a couple of definitions, kind of break things down. Um, so population is a particular section, group, or type of people or animals living in an area or country. So basically just how many beings there are in a given area. So we can break it down, in the US, in Illinois, in Naperville, but definitely whenever we're talking about pets, usually dogs and cats, although this does apply to other species like ferrets, rabbits, hamsters, guinea pigs. They can be overpopulated. So overpopulation is the condition of being populated with excessively large numbers. So there's too many to comfortably fit in a given area. So they've outgrown that area or space, so to speak. So pet overpopulation basically is there's too many homeless animals and not enough homes to take them all in. And like I mentioned, we are going to be focusing on dogs and cats since that's what Naperville Area Humane Society has. However, this does apply to other species as well. It's important to keep in mind that dog and cat breeding rates exceed the number of available homes. So for every human baby born, there are about 15 puppies and 45 kittens born at the same time. So pets often breed in litters, and that is why they can really quickly become overpopulated. So here are a couple of statistics. Basically, there are around 6.5 million animals in shelters that enter shelters every single year. We can break this down to half and half, about 3.3 million dogs and 3.2 million cats. Um, However, there's also 3.4 to 4 million animals that are adopted every year. So that's awesome that most animals entering shelters do have good outcomes. However, there are about 2 million animals that are adopted each year in the United States. And when we think about this, there's really only so many places for these animals to go. There's around 3,500 brick and mortar shelters, meaning that they're physically in buildings and they can house animals. Estimates say there's somewhere around 10,000 animal rescue organizations, so many of those are foster based. But still, that's a lot of people. However, the number of animals far exceeds the space in both brick and mortar shelters as well as just welfare organizations. We'll also talk about how much they spend. It's very costly to make sure that animals are prepared for adoptions and are being kept safe and healthy. So humane societies and rescues spend $2.5 billion annually. That's a lot of money. And that all goes towards caring for the animals, creating programs to help people keep animals in their own homes so that they're not ending up in shelters as often, preparing animals for adoption. So they are fully vetted, they get any vaccines that they don't have already, a microchip, spay and neuter, which we'll get into more detail. Many shelters also will do a behavioral evaluation or personality test, work on some training. So there's a lot of money spent to make sure that we're helping all the animals, as many animals as possible in our communities. Animal control, they work a little bit differently, but they're still very important and help us. They're friends with humane societies and rescues. So they spend around $800 million making sure that stray animals are returned to their owners when possible. Any stray that isn't reunited with its owner will be transferred to a shelter that will put it up for adoption. Animal control also helps enforce animal cruelty laws, make sure that people are caring for their animals properly, and make sure that everyone registers their dog or cat with the county to make sure they're vaccinated for rabies, since if we vaccinate all dogs and cats for rabies, we rarely see it in people, and that's required by law. So that's what animal control does. But it's important to understand the ways that animals enter shelters and rescues. So we're going to be talking about Naperville Area Humane Society specifically, but this probably looks very similar for other shelters and rescues out there. So Some of our animals are picked up, as I mentioned, from animal control, meaning that they were stray and lost, just roaming the street. Whenever an animal is picked up by animal control, they always check for a collar or microchip. If they're able to find the owner's information, they'll contact them. However, if the animal doesn't have a collar, microchip, or any identification, they will hold that animal at animal control for around 5 days. If no one reclaims that animal within 5 days, then they'll be transferred to a humane society like ours where they can get adopted. So the goal is for animals to be reunited with their owners, but if no one claims that animal, about 5 days after, they're probably not going to reclaim that animal, so it makes more sense to have them be adopted. Whenever somebody can't take care of a pet anymore, we call that owner surrender, and they bring their animal to our humane society. It could be for a number of reasons. Maybe they lost their job, had to move somewhere that doesn't allow animals, some other kind of big life change, developed allergies. So the possibilities and reasons for why someone would have to give up their pet are endless, and that's why animal shelters are here, for when people can't care for their animals anymore. We also work with other local shelters to transfer animals, try to get as many adopted as possible. So if they've had an animal sitting in their shelter for a little while, they might transfer them to our Humane Society to see if they might have some better luck getting adopted more quickly, or vice versa. Also, there's more of a pet overpopulation problem in certain states. So definitely pet overpopulation applies to the entire country, but certain states have really taken spay and neuter very seriously, and we'll get into how spay and neuter dramatically reduces pet overpopulation. So in the states that don't spay and neuter their pets, aren't enforcing identification or leash laws. There's a different attitude, so to speak, for how people care for their animals in certain areas. So there are animal welfare organizations that will collect these animals, find strays off the street in these types of areas, and bring them to other communities that have their pet overpopulation problem more under control. So there's really just three simple things that if everyone does these three things, it really makes a huge difference in slowing down and eliminating pet overpopulation. So the first thing we always want to do is make sure our pets are microchipped, because that's the best way that they're going to be reunited with their owner if they were ever lost. Adopting instead of shopping for an animal is also very important. Where you get your animals from definitely impacts the pet overpopulation problem. And finally, we want to spay and neuter all of our pets because that'll make sure that the number of pet overpopulation is going down over time. We're not adding more puppies and kittens to the pet overpopulation problem. So let's start by breaking down what a microchip is. While a collar with like a dog tag, or cats wear them too sometimes, are important, it can fall off and is not a permanent solution. A microchip is a very tiny device. It's about the size of a grain of rice, and it's implanted between the animal's shoulder blades. So it's basically just like any other shot or vaccine. It doesn't hurt the animal for very long. They forget about it, and it's over very quickly. So it doesn't take very long at all. Definitely worth getting a microchip. This means that whenever the animal is scanned with a microchip reader, it comes up with a special number that's assigned just to that animal. So if you look up the microchip number on a computer, it'll give you the animal's name, the owner's name, phone number, address, all of their information. So this is why it's the best chance to make sure a pet is returned to their owner if it's ever lost. It's put into a database, so anybody would be able to look up this information if they have a microchip scanner and a computer. And every animal shelter, animal control, veterinarian, and police station have microchip scanners. So basically, if an animal gets lost, no matter where it ends up, it's likely to be scanned for a microchip, and then its owners will be notified that the dog was found and where they can reunite with their pet. So if we're returning as many animals as possible to their owners, that means less animals are going to be waiting for new homes in shelters and rescues. So definitely microchip your animals. It's not that expensive. It's widely available. We always recommend, even, for people who have had animals for years, get them microchipped. You aren't, it won't hurt. It will only help. So like I mentioned, it's also important to understand where you should be getting your animals from. There's a huge difference between adopting an animal from a shelter or a rescue versus buying them from a pet store or a breeder. When we talk about buying a dog or cat from a pet store, they are going to make more dogs and cats in order to make more money. That's always a pet store's goal. And this might apply to some breeders as well. There are very reputable breeders out there who care for these animals and have a passion for these animals, but there are also backyard breeders and puppy mills, which could be a whole topic in of itself. They're basically puppy factories where they're trying to breed as many animals as possible and keep all of that profit. They do not take care of their animals. So we're really focusing on pet stores, backyard breeders, and puppy mills. Reputable breeders, you're still buying an animal, but at least they are putting some of that money back towards caring for the next batch of puppies or kittens. So buying an animal, like I said, their main goal, the people who you buy it from, they're going to make that money and keep it all for themselves. Very little goes back towards caring for the animals. And puppy mills, they might cut down on things that the animals need, like vet care or food, in order to save more of that money for themselves. So there's a big difference when you adopt an animal from a shelter or a rescue. You're actually saving two lives, because we're never going to make more animals. We're never breeding our animals. You're actually rescuing the pet and making space for another animal to take its place. So that's how you save two lives. The animal that you adopt, you're saving their life, and now another animal can take its place. And animal shelters, rescues never ever breed animals, so they're not going to make more because their goal isn't to make money. They're a nonprofit organization, meaning that the money they generate goes directly back towards the animals. We want to give them the very best while they're waiting for their forever home. That money also goes towards creating programs so that more animals can stay with their owners instead of end up in shelters. So they're never keeping that money for themselves. The whole goal is to help as many animals as possible. So buying an animal from a pet store means they're going to make more and keep the money. Adopting an animal means you're saving two lives, and all of that money goes towards helping the next animals that come in. So now let's talk about a few more definitions and the difference between spay and neuter. Really, there isn't a huge difference, but it's important to understand that some animals are intact. That means they have not had the spay or neuter surgery, and they can reproduce. They can have a litter of puppies and kittens. Spay is when we describe a female animal who had her ovaries and uterus removed in order to sterilize her, make sure that she can't have babies. Neuter is simply a similar term to describe the surgical procedure for males where the testicles are removed and make sure that they won't be able to contribute to having babies. So we really don't need to focus on the technical stuff. The outcome for both spay and neuter is the same. The animal will not be able to make puppies or kittens. And this is why it's really effective. If just one animal in the equation is spayed or neutered, babies aren't going to result. So it's very, very effective at cutting down those pet overpopulation numbers. It's also important to keep in mind that spay and neuter are surgical procedures where an animal goes under anesthesia and must be performed by a veterinarian. So it is a serious thing. However, veterinarians around the country do it every single day. It's a very routine surgery. They practice a lot in vet school. So while animals need lots of care and rest afterward, they normally start to feel like themselves after a day or two and are usually completely healed after a few weeks. Sometimes they might need their stitches taken out, but that's usually 10 to 14 days after. So the recovery really isn't that bad. And it's, like I said, performed all the time, all day, every day. Um, but there's a lot of myths, unfortunately, that people perpetuate about spay and neuter and why you should or shouldn't do it. So we're going to go through a couple of the things you might hear people say about spay neuter. The first is, oh, well, it's good for dogs and cats to have at least one litter of puppies or kittens. That is completely false. There are absolutely no health benefits for the parents when a litter of puppies or kittens is born. And also, you'll have to figure out how to care for and pay for and find homes for all of those babies, which is not an easy feat by any means. And we'll talk about that in some more detail in a minute. The next myth is you should wait until the animal reaches 6 months old or has their first heat cycle or reproductive cycle. Once again, this is completely false, and sometimes you might even hear older veterinarians say something along these lines because they're not informed on the new science. Waiting to spay or neuter might actually do more harm than good. The more likely they are to develop certain issues with remaining intact. We'll get into some other things that result from spay or neuter surgery, but the age at which an animal is spayed or neutered is directly tied to how long they will live and their health and behavior. So it's always better to spay and neuter early on for the most part. The only exception might be for large breed dogs, very large breed dogs. We're talking like Great Danes, Irish Wolfhound type of dogs. Because they need some of those hormones for bone and joint development to prevent problems later on in life. So unless you have a super, super tall, big dog, you really have absolutely no reason to wait. And like I said, it might actually do more harm than good waiting for them to be able to reproduce. If you wait till that 6 months, they might get pregnant and, have a litter of puppies or kittens, which once again is not necessary whatsoever. So some people say you shouldn't spay or neuter very young or very old animals. That's another false statement. An animal can be spayed or neutered at almost any age. Unless we're talking about very senior or elderly animals, there's very little risk for adult animals to undergo the surgery, and they're more likely to have other medical or behavioral problems if they remain intact. So it's always better to get them spayed or neutered, and that will actually save you time and money down the line because they might not have other health issues from not being spayed or neutered. It is safe to spay or neuter dogs and cats as early as 8 weeks, so at only 2 months old, they can be spayed or neutered. And usually here at NAHS, once they hit that 8-week mark and they weigh 2 pounds, they're overall healthy and in good condition, we'll send them off for spay and neuter as soon as that happens. So those are the only requirements. So pretty quick is allowed to spay and neuter. Whoops. Let's get into the next myth, which is it will make them much less likely to develop certain cancers, and that one is true. So studies show that dogs and cats that have been spayed or neutered live longer lives, usually on average at least 3 to 5 years longer than animals that were not spayed or neutered. So they've shown that when spayed before 6 months, female animals have less than a 0.05% chance of developing breast cancer or uterine infections. So that's a super, super minuscule chance of developing any problems related to the body parts that were removed. If, a female animal is spayed, most of those parts are gone, those hormones are going to decrease and won't lead to developing breast cancer or those other infections. Very similar results have been found for neutered males. They virtually have no chance of developing testicular cancer and are much less likely to develop problems with their prostate. So once again, it's always better to spay and neuter early on. Studies are really showing that the earlier the better. Basically, if an animal waits till after 6 months, then the chance of them developing these types of issues when they get older is a bit higher. So it's always better to spay and neuter sooner for the most part, except for those large breed dogs like we mentioned before. So some people might say it'll change a dog or cat's personality, intelligence, affection, and those are all false statements. Spay and neuter does not change who the animal is, but will improve certain behaviors. So behaviors are like habits. Intact animals really are controlled by their hormones that will develop into these unwanted behaviors, whereas animals that have been spayed or neutered aren't ruled just by those hormones. They can calm down a little bit easier and aren't going to develop negative behaviors. But either way, it'll never change that animal's personality. That's determined at birth and how they're treated by people and other animals. The other thing we might hear people say is it will make them less likely to bite or show aggression, and that is actually true. Spaying and neutering reduces the hormones that make them more likely to defend themselves. They've found that male dogs that are intact, so that haven't been neutered, are 2.6 more likely to bite than neutered males. And animals that are spayed or neutered are more affectionate. So they actually want to be around people more because they're not as focused on those hormones or having to breed. So if they're spayed or neutered, they're usually calmer, want to cuddle up to people. So it's, and like I said, also less aggression. So much better to spay and neuter. They're happier and more loving if they've been spayed or neutered. Next, some people say it will make them gain weight or become overweight, and that's false. While it does somewhat slow an animal's metabolism or their ability to burn up calories, as long as they're getting regular exercise and are on a proper diet, those are really the keys to making sure your pet is healthy and won't become overweight. Overfeeding and not getting enough exercise are the two main factors in a pet becoming overweight. Both spayed and neutered animals and intact animals can be overweight. So spay and neutered doesn't mean that it will be overweight or gain weight. Next, they will be less likely to mark their territory or eliminate in unwanted places, have accidents in the house, and that's true because spay and neuter reduce those hormones that will cause an animal to want to mark or defend their territory. And both surgeries prevent incontinence or urinary problems. So both spay and neuter will reduce the chance that an animal might not be able to hold their bladder or go to the bathroom on accident later on in life, which tends to happen a lot with intact animals. Next, they will be more likely to have behavior issues like separation anxiety, and that is false. Getting an animal spayed or neutered reduces the chance of developing separation anxiety and other fearful behaviors. So we actually see them become less fearful. Pretty much almost always, spay and neuter will improve an animal's overall behavior because they're not as focused on having to breed. They can spend more time enjoying life with their family. They're not ruled by all of those raging hormones, basically, so they're much happier and calmer, and we see a lot of behavior issues go away once an animal is spayed or neutered. The last thing that a lot of people say about spay and neuter is that it's too expensive, and that's false, but it isn't necessarily cheap. Most vet care can add up between the surgery, anesthesia, medicine, and vet visit. Spay and neuter does usually cost somewhere around $200 to $300. However, this is much less expensive than caring for a litter of puppies or kittens, as well as the parent, the mom, while she's pregnant. It'll save you money down the line as well because it prevents so many of those behavior and health problems we just talked about. So really, spending $200 to $300 one time compared to thousands of dollars over several years is a much better value. Almost all animal rescue organizations spay or neuter their animals before they go up for adoption. That's what we do here. So if you adopt, it's already included. The spay or neuter surgery is kind of already included in the adoption fee. You wouldn't have to go worry about it, yourself. It's all done one time and then they're set for life. So if you don't think you could pay for the surgery itself, just adopt from your local rescue or shelter, and that animal is very likely to be spayed or neutered. And probably microchipped too. There are also lots of low or no cost spay and neuter programs. So if anyone doesn't have the financial means to pay for a spay or neuter surgery, there are great programs and organizations dedicated to giving those people a place where they can bring their pets and get them spayed or neutered for low or no cost. So there's definitely options out there. We want to make sure that all animals are spayed and neutered. We do hear people say, though, but I really, really want to raise puppies and kittens. And while we understand baby animals are very, very cute and lots of fun, however, just like human babies, they require a tremendous amount of time, energy, and hard work. You have to be really responsible if you're going to take care of a litter of puppies or kittens. And the average person most likely doesn't have the time, experience, or extra money to be able to care for all of those puppies and kittens. If you work or go to school, that's a big chunk of your life and time that you wouldn't be able to spend with those puppies and kittens that they need. If you Do you have experience with animal health and behavior? Because there's a lot to learn in order to be able to care for puppies and kittens. Kittens sometimes need round-the-clock attention, and puppies, there's lots of different things that can pop up early on in their life that make them sick. So there's a lot required to understand, make sure that you're giving those puppies and kittens everything they need. And also, it's very, very costly. Do you have, a few $1,000 or at least several $100s laying around for all the food, supplies, and vet care needed for both the mother and each baby, you'll probably be very overwhelmed by all of the expenses. They estimate that the first year of raising one single dog is around $2,800. Like I mentioned, both puppies and kittens need lots of medicine and vet checks while they're growing. And they have to wait until 8 weeks, not only to be spayed and neutered, but to be separated from their mom and go up for adoption or be placed in a home. So you have to be willing to spend lots of money and all that time for at least 8 weeks, and that obviously doesn't include the pregnancy, where you would have to care for the mom while she's pregnant for about 2 months either. So a lot of time, money, and effort for sure. Even just adding up the 4 dewormer treatments that kittens and puppies get equals about the same as one spay or neuter surgery. So it makes much more sense in terms of time and money if you just get a pet spayed or neutered compared to raising those puppies and kittens. So when people have accidental litters or think that it'll be fun and that they can handle it, but they end up being overwhelmed, where do you think those animals end up? So unfortunately, they end up in animal shelters, which are already overwhelmed with the number of homeless animals. So while you might think it's fun to raise a litter of puppies and kittens, most people, and we mean it, most people are not able to handle this, and those puppies and kittens then get put into a shelter, which isn't fair to them. So it's better to adopt an animal instead of allowing your animal to reproduce. So let's take a look at how spay and neuter have really impacted pet overpopulation. It makes a difference for that individual animal because we've talked about it'll help them live a longer, happy, healthier life, such as reduce spraying and marking behaviors. They're not as likely to roam or show aggression. They have a much, much, much lower risk of cancer. And it'll increase their lifespan. So it's good just for that specific animal to be spayed or neutered. But it also has a bigger impact of helping save lives of even more homeless animals across the country. So if we look at some more statistics, back in 1970, it was estimated around only 10% of pets were being spayed or neutered. Now, they're pretty sure it's closer to 83% of dogs and 91% of cats have been spayed or neutered. And we kind of talked about how many animals are in shelters earlier on in the presentation. And I think we said there were 6.5 million animals currently in shelters. And on a good year, there's around 4 million adopted. So unfortunately, there's just not enough space, and sometimes shelters do have to make very difficult decisions because there's too many animals and not enough space or homes to keep them all. So back in the 70s, shelters euthanized around 13 million animals a year, which is devastating and awful. And luckily, that number is down to 1.5 million. We obviously want that number to be zero, but that can be directly tied toward people going to shelters to adopt more often, more people microchipping their animals, and a higher return rate to owners, as well as spay and neuter. All of those things have made a huge difference. So 13 million to 1.5 million is a big jump, and we're not done there. You can take a look at some of the charts down here, so we can see that there's a big decline. So only 10% of people were spaying and neutering here, and lots of animals had to be euthanized because there wasn't enough space for them in shelters. But as people spay and neuter, the number of animals slowly declines, the number of animals entering shelters declines, and now closer to in 2010 and 2020, we're at a much more manageable rate. And you can also see that here, where when when people are spaying and neutering, the intake in shelters goes down, as well as the euthanasia rate, and the number of animals adopted, the live release rate, actually increases. So if we spay and neuter, it has a big impact on animals all across the country, and we can see that it's made a big difference over time. So do your part. It's really easy to just do those 3 simple things that really impact pet overpopulation. First, make sure your animal is microchipped. This means that more animals will be returned to their owners whenever they're lost and won't end up in shelters waiting for a new home. Next, adopt. Make sure that you're going to an animal shelter or rescue. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier, as always, we're focusing on dogs and cats, but there's rescue organizations for every single animal out there. It's always better to go to a rescue that hasn't contributed to the pet overpopulation problem. You're actually saving 2 lives, the animal that you're taking home, as well as the one that will be able to take that spot. And their adoption fee goes to help all the other homeless animals. And finally, spay and neuter are really, really important. It makes your pet happier and healthier, and it dramatically helps reduce pet overpopulation. So remember, when you microchip, adopt instead of shop, and spay or neuter, you're being a responsible pet owner as well as a good citizen. So hope you guys learned something about spay and neuter and how it's really impacted the pet overpopulation problem. Hopefully you guys are doing all of these things, but like I mentioned, there's plenty of programs out there to help you if you haven't yet. So thank you guys for tuning in today.